Well, thank you, Mayor, Council members. Bob Weeks, 2451 Regency Lakes Court in Wichita. You know, when we talk about these policies, I'd like to just illustrate how difficult it is to actually stick to these policies, and we have to ask ourselves, do we really have the will to do that? So in the draft of the new economic development policy, and I believe this is in the present policy, the cost-benefit ratio needs to be 1.3 to 1 or greater for both the general fund and the debt service fund for the city of Wichita. So last August, when this council considered a letter of intent for the Douglas Place project, which we now know as the Ambassador Hotel, the study came back and said the study shows a ratio of benefits to costs for the city's general fund of 2.62 to 1, which certainly passes the 1.3 to 1 threshold. But what the agenda report didn't report is the impact on the debt service fund, which is less than 1, 0.83. And it's even worse than that because the cost of the fund that had the positive ratio was $290,000, while the cost of the fund that had the negative, well, less than 1 ratio was over $7 million. You add those two together and the cost-benefit ratio for both funds to the city was 0.9. Well, after that, I didn't see the city mention cost-benefit ratios with regard to this a project, and in today's policy we see regardless of mitigating factors the ratio cannot be less than 0 to 1. But how many ordinances did we pass that benefited the Ambassador Hotel which had a cost-benefit ratio less than what our policy says? What was the rational basis for passing all of those ordinances that day? And also when we have to think, what is the benefit that goes into these cost-benefit calculations? We know what the cost is. It's either cash money we give out to the companies or it's forgiveness of property taxes or even sales taxes in some situation. But the benefit that goes into these calculations is future increased tax revenue to the city, state, school district, and county, I guess it is. Well, how does it benefit the average citizen to have the city and government and so forth collect more taxes? I don't think it's a benefit at all. With regard to speculative industrial buildings, I spoke with a practitioner in this field who's very successful both in Wichita and across the country, and he estimates that given tax costs and industrial building rents, this policy gives the building that receives the speculative industrial tax abatement a cost advantage of about 20% over competing buildings that don't receive that. 20%, that's a lot. And he also said, is there anything in this policy to prevent existing companies in Wichita from moving to these buildings, which, if that happened, would simply move jobs from one location to another as people seek perhaps less expensive rent? And is there a limitation on the size of space someone can rent? So we can imagine someone building a 100,000 square feet building, which gets the 100% tax abatement, but the space in that building could be rented out in smaller parcels to multiple tenants, which the practitioner said that makes it easy to steal local tenants from another landlord. And then we also question, are these pre-built facilities really necessary? Two of the biggest economic development wins, if you call them that, recently was wind industry facilities in Newton and Hutchinson. Both of those companies built their own buildings. They held groundbreaking in an empty field and built their own building. We also have to realize this, and so much of our economic development policy is focused around relieving the cost of tax. Earlier this year, the Tax Foundation released a report that examined the tax costs of businesses in the states and in selected cities in each state. Wichita was one of the cities for Kansas. And the news for Kansas was worse than just bad. Our state couldn't have performed much worse. Kansas ranked 47th among the states for tax costs for mature business firms and 48th for new business firms. And that new business firms are an important criteria or a metric because those are the firms that typically receive economic development incentives. And Wichita, I said, was cited in that report. We didn't do very well, perhaps a little bit better than the state of Kansas at whole, but not much better. Now, it would be one thing if all the stuff we're doing is really working. But Mayor, in your State of the City address this January or February, whenever it was, you said our economic development efforts created 1,000 jobs. And that sounds like a lot of jobs. But when you put that in context, when you go to the Department of Labor and realize how many people are the size of the labor force in Wichita, that number is barely more than 0.5% of the labor force. And when you realize that that number is over optimistic, because some of those jobs would have been created anyway, no doubt about that. That number doesn't include the cost of the incentives. That number doesn't include the cost of the overhead of the Office of Urban Development, the offices in the county, the offices at GWEDEC, all of those costs as well. So I think we have to realize that our economic development efforts, which are, as we say, very similar to what other cities and states are doing, are simply not working very well. I've spoken to you in the past about Art Hall of the Center for Applied Economics at the Kansas University School of Business. He writes that public officials believe they can influence the course of their state and local economies through incentives and subsidies, but there's really not much evidence that they can. He recommends that we end this benchmarking, he calls it, the bidding wars for large employers that Wichita and Kansas has been pursuing, and employ a strategy built on embracing dynamism, treating all companies the same, ending this targeted economic development strategy, the active investor strategy he calls it. He says such a strategy, far from losing opportunity, can distinguish itself by building unique capabilities that create a different mix of value that can enhance the probability of long-term economic success through enhanced opportunity. Embracing dynamism can change how Kansas plays the game. Mayor and Council, I would submit that this policy that we're considering today, a revision and even expansion of our existing policies, is not going to be the path to prosperity and jobs for Wichita. I would recommend that we put this policy aside, rethink about how we can really build an economy we can be proud of in Wichita. And if there's time, I'd be happy to answer questions.
Oh, you kind of ran out of time here some time ago, but Councilman Meitzner?
Hey, Mr. Weeks, thanks for your information. I agree with many of your points. I sympathize with them. How do we take this theory and how do we compete as a city even within our own state? I mean, we can kind of control what we do in the city. We may have an impact on state, but we surely can't compete. We don't have any policies that affect Oklahoma and other states that are trying to lure our industries. But let's focus on, how do you propose, or what would you suggest that we do as a city when the rest of the state is doing? We received a document, a comparison document on all the cities within our state, and a lot of them, on what they do. For instance, many of them don't even have a clawback provision. If they default, then it's just maybe over with on future stuff, things like that. So there's minimal disciplines in our competing communities. And how do you propose, I mean, do you take this theory to the state level and have the state neutralize all, or what would be your suggestion?
Well, that would be a step. Many of the programs, such as TIF districts, tax abatements, the industrial revenue bonds, the community improvement districts, et cetera, those are authorized by state statutes. So certainly we could ask Mr. Goder, and when you think about your legislative platform this year, let's ask for those to be eliminated, perhaps.
But how do we compete? Like right now, some of our vacant buildings on the speculation building, for instance. Right now, none of those vacant buildings have qualified for, as the Business Journal has stated, we had 20 inquiries since January 1st that we kind of replied to 3 of them. We couldn't even reply to 17 of them. I assume that means that the existing buildings we have with our existing vacancies and owners, they didn't qualify for any of these opportunities. So between now and if the state would change the policy and make it statewide, how do you propose that we compete in this environment?
Well, first of all, like the tax foundation, our tax costs for business are just, I mean, at the very bottom of the states. So we need to streamline our government and reduce costs, which in turn reduce taxes. And, you know, if we have to grant tax abatements to get a building built, I think that's tacit recognition that our taxes are too high and our taxes prevent business investment. And again, I would say our record of accomplishment is not good. So what we've been doing has not been working very well. We can distinguish ourselves. I mean, if we really sought to reduce these incentive programs and have an equal playing field for everyone, that would distinguish us amongst the cities and states. At the state level, there's some movement in that direction with the tax reform that was passed this year and perhaps things that will happen next year as well.
Okay, well, I appreciate it. I struggle with how to compete. I don't like some of these incentives that we are challenged with. I don't like a lot of them, but I don't like competition worse than I don't like the incentives. So it's like picking winners and losers, so to speak, as you as you referred to. But it's not a fun game to play, especially when I look at our neighboring cities that have no return on investment requirements, no clawback incentives. What was done in Hutchinson, yes, they built that building, but that was a shovel-ready project that was done without any return on investment considerations at all in Hutchinson. And so it's really difficult, and I empathize tremendously with the theories of what we need to do on our tax policies, but I don't know how that directly affects the things that, like I said, it's August right now, so in 8 months we've had 20 opportunities that we could not respond to, and that's sad, and even with the existing buildings we have, so to speak. So it's difficult, and I respect exactly what you're saying, and maybe we can change that at the maybe the state can change that and require all of us to play under the same rules. Might be a good way to go. So thank you for your comments.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor.